Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Welcome to another session on Talk Architecture podcast. I'm your host, Naziaty Mohd Yaacob. We start with the question, when and why did architecture isolate itself as a profession? Okay, this is an argument that is found in Quora. And in fact, that topic, that question itself, is in this website as a topic. There is a link on that question as well. This is a discussion 2 years ago, quoting a debate between Peter Eisenman and Christopher Alexander. Peter Eisenman started with this. I would like to suggest that if I were not here agitating, nobody would know what Chris's idea of harmony is, and you all would not realize how much you agree with him. ... Walter Benjamin talks about the destructive character, which he says is reliability itself, because it's always constant. If you repress the destructive nature, it is going to come out in some way. If you're only searching for harmony, the disharmonies and incongruencies which define harmony and make it understandable will never be seen. A world of total harmony is no harmony at all. Because I exist, you can go along and understand your need for harmony, but do not say that I'm being irresponsible or make a moral judgment that I am screwing up the world, because I would not want to have to defend myself as a moral imperative for you. Christopher Alexander says, "Good God." Peter Eisenman continues, "Nor should you feel angry. I think you should feel this harmony is something that the majority of the people need and want. But equally, there must be people out there like myself who feel the need for incongruity and disharmony." Chris said, "If you were an unimportant person, I would feel quite comfortable letting you go your own way. But the fact is that people who believe as you do are really fucking up the whole profession of architecture right now by propagating these beliefs." Excuse me for saying the word. Excuse me, I'm sorry, but I feel very, very strongly about this. It's all very well to say, look, harmony here, disharmony there, harmony here, is all fine. But the fact is that we as architects are entrusted with the creation of that harmony in the world. And a group of very powerful people, yourself and others, ... Eisenman, how does someone become so powerful if he's screwing up the world? I mean, somebody is going to see through that. ... Chris, yes, I think they will quite soon. This is a excerpt, what I said just now, from the 1982 debate between Christopher Alexander and Peter Eisenman on contrasting concepts of harmony in architecture. It was an early discussion of architecture's, quote, new sciences of organized complexity. This iconic discussion took place at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design on November the 17th, 1982. It all started in the 1970s. This is what the author of this blog says. Jane Jacobs brought down Robert Moss's, and pre-ego housing was considered a failure. Modernism was labeled a failure for not delivering on its promises of social redemption made a century earlier. It was the decade of the rise of computers, technology, and consumer electronics, the introduction of postmodernism in architecture with the Vanna Venturi home, all contributed to this. Finally, globalization increased urbanization and informality served as the fuel for the fire. If you were an architect at that time, you could have seen your profession's walls crumble as fast as one could imagine. The profession was on fire from all sides. All the masters had retreated without apologizing. To inflict even more damage, they had declared that the demands of the world were substantiated. So what would have you done? Jane Jacobs, it says Peter Lynch, but I think it's Kevin Lynch, Christopher Alexander, and others were altering the way we looked at cities, thereby shifting attention away from architects and planners and towards urban designers. There's none of them in where I mean, there's very few. Architects were under attack and also had their limelight snatched away from them. Except for a few isolated cases throughout the world, the profession's common path was one of retreat. Only a few architects stepped forward to redefine their practices' modalities. The masters took on the role of pedagogues once more. They preached the same ideas under the guise of postmodernism, then neoliberalism, and finally avant-garde architecture. One of the major characteristics of the time was the prevailing theoretical establishment that remained consumed and obsessed with the formal and linguistic notions of the architecture of the past. As a result, intellectual credibility remained in the hands of a select few, and they were only given to structuralism's tenets. As a result, traditional pedagogy and practice were once again intertwined. As a result, architecture retreated and new professions arose to fill the gap. This undermined architecture's social importance. Thus, the world had become more abstract than it had ever been. It once again adopted autonomy over reality. Spanish architect and critic Ignacio de Sola Morales put it as, quote, "An interior game architecture was a cosmos sufficient into itself, fed by its own history and growing from the interiors of its laws and conventions." The critiques and mouthpieces did their best to use hyperboles. This persuaded architects to take part in the retreat, and it appealed to the vast majority of the profession. As a result, they were able to define the profession's behavior on its terms. It's worth noting that India's Architects Act was enacted in 1972 as well. We define a profession based on the excellence of masters' works and their great architecture. This profession's main aim was to protect its autonomy at all costs, not to serve and produce. How? By enclosing the degrading forces of nature. Underneath it, imperialism, modernism, and structuralism's dictatorial forces and value systems were maintained. Quote, "This expresses Eisenman's idea of order. This is not about wholeness, but rather the expression, one could say celebration, of separation and frustration. It is this, quote, social narrative that is all that matters to him." Unquote. The debate is therefore, there's no unquote. This is a quote from somewhere else. The debate is therefore, despite the title given to it at the time of, quote, discord over harmony in architecture, unquote, more about order than harmony. Foucault's order of things versus Alexander's nature of order. I've mentioned about Alexander's nature of order in the previous podcast. On the one hand, we have order presented as something subjective, socially constructed, with a flavor of representation about it, and on the other, order is something objective, a fundamental property of matter, something essentially generative. Alexander was convinced, as he had been for 20 years, well before Eisenman got into bed with any nuova scienza, new science, that order and harmony were both objective facts, susceptible to the scientific method. And since the debate took place, a number of scientists have begun to come around to this same position. By contrast, Derrida's use of science has now been classed among the intellectual impostures. So here, in the debate, we see the early stages of an inevitable clash between real science and voodoo science in architecture, which is only now coming out into the open in the wake of the publication of Charles Jang's The New Paradigm in Architecture. Subsequent architectural history shows that Alexander's, quote, new paradigm has been marginalized as professional opinion steadily embrace Eisenman's paradigm. Many questions how this could possibly have happened. Why should people have ignored the sane, reasonable, and humane vision of Alexander in order to embrace the transgressive vision of this constructivist? A vision, as Alexander pointed out 20 years ago, that neglects feeling. But of course, the deconstructivists don't neglect feeling altogether. Theirs is the feeling generated by abstractions, writ large by the shock of scale and contrast, by the sensationalism and the spectacle of the new and bizarrely transfigured, a totemic architecture of novelty. Eisenman's architecture turned out to be a perfect fit with a late industrial society, seeking ever more thrilling forms, new assemblies, alien geometries, all permutations of the same limited industrial vocabulary. The constructivists offered these world a highly entertaining new metallic expression. That it had little nutritional content was not the point. Now, I need to go and point out this debate in 1982. Looking back in 1982, some 40 plus years ago, in which we had come to a point where at that time there was electronics coming out. There's not yet the internet. There's not yet digital applications. But now we have everything, the internet and digital applications. And Christopher Alexander has been quoted as someone who's influential in computational and mathematics, science, not just in his books, Notes on the Synthesis of Form and Pattern Language that we know of. So when I think about Christopher Alexander and recently been reading the book, The Nature of Order, I know that people would say, oh, Christopher Alexander is more like a traditional architecture sort of person going back into vernacular architecture maybe, or those generative forms of the non-architects. I think it's more than that, actually. It's more than abstraction, it's more than geometries that, in Islamic architecture you can see. In traditional architecture, for example, those arabesque geometrical motifs, and maybe you can see it in the medieval architecture that shows church architecture that have all these generative sort of ideas. And in fact, those architecture, many were built by non-architects. They were using the sense of harmony and order, and this is more for the religious building that we have gone away from that. We're doing circular buildings or offices or shopping malls and so forth. Is we can have a bit of disharmony. But in lieu of many things like climate change and the sense of sustainability, it's contradictory, you see. I've seen a lot of this students' work of architecture, and even following the masters, of course. The idea that as long as you green it, you put green on the facade, or you have a lot of trees in parts of it, and the forms could be wild, or the forms could be very organic, curvilinear or circular or whatnots. And we know that circular and curvilinear forms may not be able to be sustainable, because in reconstruction or adaptability, the idea of adaptability is better that the forms or the structures of this architecture that we build could be more generative, could be replicated much more easier, could be added, more of additive and subtractive architecture. That will work best with a non-curvilinear, like a rectilinear or linear forms. Now, is it the debate between curvilinear forms and rectilinear forms? It could be down to that, actually, when you think about this in terms of structures and structures that can easily be adapted rather than structures that less adaptable. It could be even that debate when it comes down to, if you think about the science of it, the technicality of it. So why is it the question has been asked in the beginning that when and why did architecture isolate itself as a profession, is what we're discussing here. When architects adopt a certain paradigm as a whole, and now the paradigm is this sort of architecture, parametric design, or the architecture of Zaha Hadid and a number of architects such as Peter Eisenman and deconstructivists. Excuse for the noise, the background noise. So when architects as a whole, even lecturers, demand the students of architecture, please wow me with something interesting, because they got bored, lecturers in universities, only looking at the form-making exercise and to brush it up in sustainable principles or sustainable design principles. Not all of it, not true, not the gist or the, shall we say, the basic ones, but bits of it. And not asking many questions regarding about the form. Then you have this sort of trend or impressions. Impressions is what architect is all about, the architecture profession, to impress, to express and impress eventually on in society. But so society look at architecture as a profession that is, okay, you can do pretty things and you're part of the construction professional to give us taste, to sell us your taste in pretty things, or to come up with ideas that would make it nice to look at, or and if the client insists on that, who does the client answer to? So the client answers to himself or herself. It could be a group of people, not one person. So they have the funds, and to answer to oneself, that's one agenda. So one would build like this. So if society is conscious that that is not sustainable, or there is no other way apart from that sort of design, that is the trend, so society just accepts it, or I want it to be like that. I want to. But when you start asking questions about private dwellings, they may say, no, I don't really want it to be like that. I want to be simpler. And when I start working out on my maintenance costs and start thinking, all these other things to fund for that architecture, to maintain it, then there's another issue altogether. I'm not saying that any new aluminum cladded or whatever other materials that one can have to attach with curvilinear buildings, or buildings that are quite sensational and in its form other than rectilinear or linear, or even those other complex buildings that are cladded in this new materials. How do you actually maintain that, and how do you actually cope with that in terms of the cost? So hence, there is a price to pay at the end of the day for wanting this sort of architecture, because it doesn't have a set of principles that has a form of character. That was another those quotes that was asked earlier, that was mentioned earlier. That kind of harmony comes from those basics that we mentioned earlier. Yeah? I'll get back to you on that issue. And the objectivity is because of, that's a debate. When people say, why do you have to be so objective, to be stuck with objectivity, or the way of the scientific objectivity and structures, as compared to subjectivity, and architecture is subjected. It's a subjective discipline that is up to the creator, the architect, to do what he feels or what she feels that they need to create the expression. So that debate is, to me, and what is when they decided on the paradigm that architects adopt, and what is the most popular paradigm now. So what it is those people understand about this issue in its deeper sense of how architecture and architects their role in society and creation of the world. Then you would understand about, if you understood these issues and been reading a lot on these issues, you would understand exactly what is needed to be done to push against the subjective and destructive forces. A few individuals like Christopher Alexander and others who have been, including the traditionalists, had been debating against the deconstructivists in the last 20 years. And like us all, we have matured. Like Greta Thunberg has matured, we are also maturing. And in a way, we decided to profess differently, because we are against that disharmony, that subjectivity that is trending at the moment. It trickled down to other aspects of architecture. It trickled down to the star architects. It's always been looked at. They call it the masters in this discussion just now, but the star architects is whom we looked at to emulate, or there is lack of things to debate. So what Alexander does in terms of generative architecture, which could be for the non-architect even, and architecture would be pushed to the side and unable to take the middle road, because architecture or architects decided to take that subjective perspective in the architecture works, like I said earlier. So they lose out. The profession is receding away from society. If they take Chris Alexander's, which is difficult which is the more difficult and less sexy or less, interesting, because we are all about forms, then we're losing out. If we take Alexander's way to actually go beyond that, look at it in terms of the functionality mostly, look at it as almost like engineering-like, but architectural, where architects decide engineering. You see? In a moment now, architects decide form, and engineering is just part of the consultancy. But this is architects who are also the engineers, architects who are also the planners, and architects who are also when they are the planners, means they are the urban designers, because planners cannot design, architects can design. So this debate, or this article, when and why did architecture isolate itself as a profession, is very, very interesting, because it's sort of like predict what's going to happen to the architecture profession, which is not going to be respected as much. And those taking architecture opt out to work with the developers now, don't they? Or if they're working in companies, they would have to actually work with the developers as a client, or those who want to follow the subjective way. And one day, when people talk about regenerative architecture, or reusing architecture, refurbishing architecture, one day when we have no choice but to use what we've got, and we can see the weakness in some sort of architecture forms, then somebody's going to take over. Maybe the new architect, which is like the architect engineer. Maybe the profession would change to that, or maybe the profession would just become just the profession in the contract also serve the client. So it's not, architects are not at fault, because society, that's the way society is, because the developer need to make money, and the architect is the developer, the developers, the one working for the developer, and whatever the developer wants, as if the architect doesn't have a way to actually ask questions. Because you can serve your client without asking questions, or you can inform your clients, you can teach your clients. And I remember this discussion I had with Kevin Matlow on teaching your clients. So architects have a duty to actually educate society on what's best. And this is what this article is all about. It's a very interesting article, and I hope that there are more such debate in the future, informed debate actually, of theory and philosophy, which actually informs architecture practice and our way of looking at architecture. Okay, thank you for listening, and hope to meet you again in the next podcast episode.